Hello, thank you for joining us. It's the third day of the Hong Kong International Literary Festival's 20th anniversary edition. My name is Catherine Platt and I'm the festival director. So we're running virtual events all this weekend and through next week until the 15th of November. And if you're here in Hong Kong, you can also join us for live events at Asia Society and Tai Kwun. Visit our website, festival.org.hk, for full details of the program. I have really been looking forward to this session that we're about to begin, partly because it ties in so well with our festival theme, the future perfect element of our past tense future perfect theme. And well, who isn't fascinated by evolution and the ancient past and being able to look back into the distant past to help us understand how we're evolving in the future? I think that's a topic I can't wait to hear more about. But before we start, I'm just going to run through a few housekeeping points about the Crowdcast platform, especially if you're here for the first time. You can post comments in the chat on the right-hand side of the screen. If you have a question for Adam or Rebecca, can you put it in the Ask a Question box down on the right-hand side? And then Sarah and they will be able to see the questions there. There'll be a green button that comes up at the bottom of the screen saying buy the books here, and that will connect you to our festival bookseller, Bookazine. So do click through to take a look at the landing page there and support your local bookstore and also support our authors. They all appear in the festival for free, and the best way to thank them and support their work is to buy their books. Just to let you know, this event is going to stay here on the Crowdcast platform until the end of November, and it's a free event, so please share the link and invite people to watch. It will, although of course it's in English right now, but within 48 hours we will post a version with Chinese subtitles added. So just before we start, I want to say a few thank yous to our cultural partners, all of our sponsors and our donors for their generous support. And in particular, I'd like to acknowledge an ongoing grant from the Standing Committee on Language, Education and Research. So I'm going to introduce our moderator for today. We're very pleased to be joined by Sarah Lazarus. She is a digital producer and editor for CNN's Global Features team. She ran Hong Kong's Café Scientifique for 7 years, and she has written a book called Troubled Waters, The Changing Fortunes of Whales and Dolphins, which was published by London's Natural History Museum. I actually had no idea when I asked Sarah to lead this conversation that she had studied evolution herself or that she ran the Café Scientifique. So that has worked out very well. And I'm looking forward to hearing the session today. I'm going to hand over to Sarah, who will introduce our speakers, Adam Hart and Rebecca Wragg Sykes. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Catherine. I'm absolutely delighted to be moderating this session here from my quarantine hotel in Central. Human evolution, as Catherine said, I studied it. It's always been my #1 favorite subject. And like Catherine, I'm fascinated about the story of where we came from. And what's more, in recent years, there's been huge amount of scientific developments that have shed a lot more light on our origins and also given us more ways to understand what our evolutionary history can tell us about human society today. So now I'd like to introduce our 2 speakers, as well as the books that we will be discussing. So our first speaker is Rebecca Wragg Sykes, who's an honorary fellow at the universities of Liverpool and Bordeaux. Rebecca is an archaeologist who specialises in the Paleolithic, and she's been fascinated by the deep past since she was a child. As an adult, she's studied Neanderthals for over 15 years, looking at their technology, their cognition, and their social life. And during that time, she's become widely recognized for her public communication, including writing and broadcasting. And she's also the co-founder of Trailblazers, which is an organization dedicated to highlighting women in archaeology and the earth sciences. And perhaps most importantly for today, she's the author of this beautiful book, which is called Kindred, Neanderthal Life, Love, Death and Art. Now, all the species that have lived on Earth over the course of human evolution, I think Neanderthals are for many the most fascinating, partly because they overlap with our own species. And at one point, modern humans and Neanderthals were coexisting. And as a consequence, many of us carry Neanderthal DNA. But despite this kinship and this close relationship, Neanderthals are frequently misunderstood, and they're stereotyped as brutish and benighted. And that's something that Rebecca sets out to address in her book, which explores who the Neanderthals really were, how they lived, and what our understanding of them reveals about ourselves. And then my second author today is Adam Hart. Adam is a biologist, a broadcaster, and an author, and he's Professor of Science Communication at the University of Gloucestershire. Adam works in a variety of, actually a really wide variety of research areas, including insects, African conservation, and citizen science. He's a regular presenter for BBC Radio 4 and the World Service, and he's presented a number of documentary series on BBC and other TV channels. This is his latest book. It's called Unfit for Purpose, and it explores the mismatch between our fundamental biology and the modern world that we have created and live in. So themes that he looks at are stress, obesity, poor mental health, drug addiction, bowel diseases, violence, and fake news. It's like a stark checklist of modern world problems, each one of which echoes our evolutionary past. So to kick off, the first thing I'd like to discuss is perhaps the most surprising item on that list, which is fake news. Adam, you write in your book about fake news and how the way that it has proliferated and become such a problem in recent times can be understood to a certain extent through looking at our evolutionary history. You write that functioning human communities and societies depend on a level of trust between members, but of course there's a very fine line between trust and gullibility. So can you explain how our evolutionary past is fueling the enormous problem in misinformation that we see in modern society?
Yeah, it's certainly a big topic at the moment, isn't it? I'm looking at my Twitter feed now, and half the messages seem to have some sort of warning on it at the moment. But fake news is an interesting one to look for echoes of our evolutionary past. You know, some of the things I talk about in the book are quite clearly biological, and we can sort of track genetic backgrounds and all sorts of other things. This is perhaps a little bit more of a sort of extending that thesis, but I think there are some echoes in our evolutionary past when we look at the importance of as you mentioned, trust. We're a social organism. We do very well in groups. Actually, right now, of course, being in groups is proving to be our Achilles heel. And it's interesting that globally, one of the ways we're tackling COVID is to break up social groups. You know, so that's an interesting kind of sort of part of that. But our evolutionary past has set up mental heuristics, so mental ways of thinking about things, our cognition, the way that we go about doing things that enable us to build up these trusting relationships with people around us. And that enables us to function better in groups and as individuals. And some of the things that we can investigate, so using some sort of techniques from psychology and things, are things like confirmation bias, for example. We're much more likely to believe things that we already believe. And we're also much more likely to believe good things of those around us that we've built up a trust for. So it's a sort of positive reinforcement. The people around us, we're more likely to believe good things of, and the out group, the others, we're more likely to believe bad things of. And if we link this into things like the halo effect, for example, where attractive people, people who are confident, tend to be have other values assigned to them. So they tend to have values of trustworthiness, for example, or success assigned to them, even when they haven't actually earned that those attributes. And when we start piling all these in to things like mainstream news, where we have a sort of recent cultural history of believing mainstream news. You know, when I was growing up, when I was younger, you would sit down and watch the news. It was a daily event. And it had all the accoutrements of modern news, and people were telling you things, and everyone believed what was being said. Now, of course, we've got news coming out of our ears. We have too much news, and too much commentary dressed up as news. But all of those things have this kind of halo effect around them, whereby we have a tendency to believe them. And we can link those things into our evolutionary past. So the halo effect, for example, where we are more likely to assign positive attributes to people who are attractive, for instance, may well be linked to some of the things of some of the features of sexual selection. So if you look in other organisms, certainly organisms that are more symmetrical tend to be, or what we would describe as perhaps more attractive, tend to be more favored when females are choosing males, for example. Males that are more dominant and more confident in other species tend to get more mates, and so on. So when we look at evolutionary traits in other organisms, we can quite clearly see these patterns. And it's quite interesting then to reflect within our own sort of biology whether or not we can see those things. So I think there is this evolutionary sort of echo in the way that we deal with other people, the way that we deal with our own groups, the way that we assign values. We have these quick rules of thumb, these quick heuristics. This person is this. We don't have time to interrogate them for the next 3 hours to find out if they're all these other things. We make certain assumptions, and those assumptions generally work out. Of course, what we have now, I mean, the big issue with fake news is not so much our evolutionary past, but another echo of our evolution, I suppose, is the fact that we have developed such a phenomenal way of spreading it around. You know, our ability to come up with novel ideas and to develop technology has led to the internet, and that is the ideal vehicle for spreading fake news and for spreading information that's not true, because fake news isn't a new thing. You can see it through antiquity, you know, all the way back to sort of Mark Antony and before, and you can see lots of things going on in the 1700s, for example, where false information is being put around. So it's not a new thing, but our ability to spread it is, and that's one of the features actually of quite a few of the chapters of the book. The modern world is this very potent environment, whether it's drugs, whether it's the food that's available to us, or in this case, whether it's information, and our brains are not really wired for that. We can stop ourselves believing in it, but we have to make positive efforts to do that. I think if we don't, it's very tempting to just slip into sort of confirmation bias and halo effects and allow ourselves to become fed by information that isn't true.
Thank you, Rebecca. I'd like to use that as a jumping off point. So Adam was referring to the fact in modern humans, there's a tendency to trust, and, you know, our lives are built on the fact we like to chat a lot. What was communication like for Neanderthals? How sophisticated was it? And what do we know about how it compares to modern humans in terms of community structures and relationships?
There's a couple of different threads there. What a lot of people always want to know about Neanderthals is, did they have language? And you can address that from different perspectives. You can look at the anatomy and the perspective on sort of the bones, basically, because we don't have any soft tissues for Neanderthals. We don't have like a nice preserved body in the permafrost. We only have their bones. However, what we can say about that has kind of changed somewhat over the years as analysis techniques have sort of just become more sophisticated. So it used to be believed that Neanderthals lacked the ability to control their breath very well, which would allow them to do what I'm doing, which is just keep talking, get the words out, and my breath's coming out quite slowly in a controlled way. We don't think that's necessarily true anymore, but other things also sort of stack up to them having some kind of vocal communication, including the fact that we have hyoid bones, which is the bone that supports your voice box, basically. And that, although it's not identical to ours, it's pretty similar. And if you basically reconstruct where that would have gone in their body relation to the skull and the spine and everything, it looks like the sounds they would have been able to produce were pretty sort of comparable, and perhaps some differences with vowels. But really one of the more sort of, for me, convincing aspects is to do with the ear. Some very well preserved skulls, you can examine the inner ear anatomy and basically reconstruct that like in 3D and make some nice models. And what that allows you to do is see that their inner ear is not the same as ours. But what seems to have happened is that there's sort of shifted from our common ancestor. So we shared a common ancestor with Neanderthals somewhere around 500 to 700,000 years ago, which is actually not that long ago. And our skull went one way, went all sort of round and blur, and theirs kind of went sort of a bit longer, and their face pulled forward. So the ear anatomy changed. But if you model how those inner ears actually work and the sound frequencies they appear to be tuned into, their ears are basically like listening out for the same frequencies ours are, which is speech. So that's a good indication that some kind of vocal communication was a really important everyday part of their life, and including also that implies with the common ancestor too, before Neanderthals. But whether, you know, what they talked about, that's a different question, you know. And the complexity of the structure of that, of the talking, you know, the speech, we don't know. We cannot see that from the bones. That's where the archaeology comes in. And what we then get into is the realms of people, specialists debating how difficult is it to learn how to do X, Y, Z technology without talking to each other. You know, is it possible to just, for example, learn some quite sophisticated stone tool technologies, or teach someone how to hunt with a spear, you know, a wooden spear, to make those wooden spears, which themselves are actually really sort of objects of craftsmanship. Can you do all of that and plan hunts without some kind of discussion? So for me, I think there had to be something, but I would not like to say the sophistication and the complexity of the structure of what was being sort of discussed. But in terms of the social networks as well, that's a somewhat different question, but it does link to, you know, how easy is it to form and maintain your social networks without language? Language allows you to discuss things in the future and in the past. You're not living in the moment. So if you can do that, then that really changes the scale at which you live in your everyday life. You can plan ahead. You can discuss things that happened that, you know, you might say, oh, well, last year the mammoth didn't come here, you know. If you can't do that, things are difficult. And also then it does mean that if you encounter other groups, did they all have the same understanding of vocal communication? We don't know. But I think overall, I think most specialists would say there was some kind of talking of a sort, but what the words were, I don't know. That's all I'm saying.
Thank you. All right. So the next thing I want to talk about, very different subject, is food and the Paleolithic diet. So there's been a huge amount of enthusiasm in recent years for the paleo diet, which involves broadly, it speaks to the belief that our digestive systems evolved before the advent of agriculture. And according to advocates of the paleo diet, we're better suited to eating meat and vegetables, but not to eating grains. So here I am in hotel quarantine, not doing a huge amount of exercise, wondering how I might lose a bit of weight when I get home. So I wanted to ask your advice. Should I try to copy my ancestors, and do I really need to give up pasta? So Adam, what have you learnt about that?
Well, it's a tremendously seductive idea, isn't it? It really lends into a whole load of sort of, I mean, almost kind of conceits of the modern world, isn't it? It's a sort of, it's this kind of atavistic sort of throwback idea. Actually, first of all, it ignores the fact that a considerable amount of evolution has occurred in humans, including the ability to be able to process things that are a consequence of our development of agriculture, which was the single biggest thing that happened to us. You know, that's this enormous event where we changed the way that we do things. We wouldn't be sitting here having these conversations if it hadn't been for the evolution of agriculture across the world, across quite a long period of time, actually. And initially that evolution, or that development, sorry, not evolution, but that development of agriculture caused quite a few problems for us, or for our ancestors. So, you know, we have had an evolutionary sort of response to that. in terms of our digestion. But in terms of the paleo diet, there have been so that the basic conceit of the paleo diet is that you don't have modern processed foods. That the basic idea seems to be, if you couldn't have stood sort of out in the wild sort of 14,000 years ago and harvested it yourself, then you shouldn't eat it in the modern world. And actually, when you look at it, there's an awful lot that you wouldn't be able to do. But people have studied the paleo diet, and there's been a couple of quite interesting sort of long-term studies over it. And what you see is that people that stick to the paleo diet over the first 6 months, actually, they lose weight. And they do as well as almost any other diet. And you look at it, you think, oh, okay, that's cool. And they report that they're feeling quite good in some cases, although in some other cases they report that they have an excessive amount of diarrhea. And the other general report is that it costs an absolute fortune. But nonetheless, it works. But then it just basically, and it seems to outstrip sort of other conventional diets. I suggest possibly because of the psychological motivation of really getting stuck into it. But then what happens is that that's normally happens with diets. People sort of plateau, and it provides you no advantage whatsoever. And then the disadvantages seem to kick in for a lot of people, which is that it's very difficult to stick to. It's not very easy at all, both from a sort of culinary perspective and from a financial perspective. And there do seem to be some other sort of drawbacks and side effects, and consequently it doesn't really seem to provide any particular advantage. The basic essence of it is, if you limit your dietary intake, if you have a calorie controlled diet, if your diet consists of, we don't have a lot of refined sugar, obviously the paleo diet has none. If you cut that out, if you cut out fat, then yes, you will lose weight. But does it give you any advantage because it somehow links in with your, the beautiful evolved animal that we are? Actually, there doesn't seem to be much evidence for that. And the evidence is really kicking into the idea that we have evolved over the last 12,000 years or so to cope with our changing environment. So yeah, the paleo diet, no one's going to sit and tell you that it doesn't work, but it certainly doesn't seem to be the easiest to follow, and actually does also have some implications in terms of nutrients. So calcium, for example, can be a problem with it too. So I'm afraid, having read around about this quite a bit and spoken to a few people that have been involved with it, I'm not convinced that it's a long-term strategy for it's not a lifetime, not a sort of lifestyle change that I would like to do personally.
Yeah, so in the window since we started growing crops, is that a long enough time for our digestive systems to evolve significantly?
Yeah, I mean, you can see. Yeah, and in fact, I mean, Rebecca would be best to talk about this in terms of our physical changes, but our skull shapes and we've become much sort of, our skulls are much more sort of I suppose fragile would be the word, less robust, because we're processing with our hands rather than our teeth. We have changed the way that we do things. So we can digest these things, and actually an awful lot of people do very well off the modern diet. It's interesting though, isn't it, that we do generally thrive, of course, but we do have these issues. So dairy, for example, lactose intolerance, or the lack of persistence of the enzyme that allows us to digest milk. Over here in Europe, we sort of take it as read that adults can eat baby food, which is what we're doing when we're eating milk. Actually, that's not the case across the world, and where you are, lactose intolerance is far higher, and that's because the evolution of dairying has sort of gone hand in hand with the advantage of being able to take advantage of the products that sort of cattle can produce. So you get this sort of lovely kind of hand-in-hand sort of process whereby our farming techniques mirror evolutionary changes that are going on and enhance the farming, and that enhances the advantage. And you can see that spreading through Europe. But where dairying didn't take hold, and where cattle weren't being used for that purpose, or weren't being used at all, you don't see that ability, and actually that that can cause some issues, particularly with calcium and things like osteoporosis and so on. So there are lots of evolutionary sort of echoes, recent evolutionary echoes in sort of dietary patterns across the world, but sort of harking back to a past of sort of hunter-gathering and things is not really the way forward. Plus the fact it's actually extremely difficult we can work out what people ate in the past, of course, but coming up, there's a big step from working out what people ate to coming up with a diet plan and sort of recipes and so on, and trying to fit it in that way. So it can be quite challenging.
Yeah. Thank you. Rebecca, what did Neanderthals eat, as far as we know? They're classically depicted as hunters with very muscular arms for throwing spears. Have advances in science given us more information about how they got their food and what they ate?
Yeah, well, I don't know if anyone watching knows the game Skyrim, the Xbox and PC game Skyrim. In that you've got giants herding mammoths to make cheese from their milk. I don't think that was going on. I don't think there was any varying. But no, I mean, it's really fascinating, actually, the shift in what we understand that Neanderthals were eating has really expanded the past sort of 30 years or so. So many aspects of our understanding of their lives have, because archaeology itself has, like, you know, absolutely transformed in that period. The kind of techniques that we have now are, you know, mind-blowing, really, what we can do. And I think one of the main changes, there's two changes, really. One is that there used to be this understanding that well, once we got over sort of thinking, oh, maybe Neanderthals were just scavengers and they were actually really rubbish at hunting, when we accepted that they were good hunters, and that they were responsible largely for much of the animal bones we find in their sites, then this idea that, oh, perhaps they were sort of only hunting big game and they were kind of stuck in that kind of rut. And that's why we were so much better, allegedly, because we had a very broad sort of diet. You know, we had smaller game and sort of exploited plants and things more. That really has kind of become very difficult to support that idea. Neanderthals definitely were top hunters in their local environment, and they could take on the biggest of the animals. It really does seem that they were hunting mammoths now, which also was debated for a while. You know, could they really actually take on mammoths? But it is looking like for some Neanderthals they did eat a lot of it, and they were certainly hunting baby mammoths, which are pretty difficult to get away from a herd. So there's sort of good evidence for that. But also other massive creatures like woolly rhinoceros, they're huge. And if you're talking about warm climates, because we shouldn't forget Neanderthals lived through multiple phases of climate change over 300,000 years plus. And that means that they were living during times when it was warm like it is now. We call that an interglacial, and even warmer times than today, you know, 2 to 4 degrees warmer. So during those times, the big woolies were replaced by other megafauna, elephants and different kinds of rhinoceros, water buffalo we have in Europe as well. You know, so there's a lot of big creatures, and they were taking them. The only ones that I don't think there's any evidence for actual butchery for is hippos, and hippos are super dangerous, so I would not take on a hippo. But they did more than just the big beasts. What we see really is that what Neanderthals were interested in was quality, whether it was the species or the parts of the animals. And they basically, in whatever environment they were in, they took the best of what was around them. So that did include some big game, but in the Mediterranean, where sort of the impact of very cold climate was much less, and it tended to dry out a bit rather than get super cold. The woodlands there, they were full of red deer. You know, that's a medium-sized animal, boar, roe deer, and they were taking those all the time, and that was their focus because it made the most sense. But equally, we can see from many different studies over the past few years, past few decades rather, that they were also taking small game. So we can see evidence for rabbits, birds, potentially freshwater fish, certainly coastal resources, so shellfish, probably the crabs and sea urchins and fish bones we see in coastal sites are probably from wading, or actually getting stuff that's been sort of stuck in rock pools when the tide goes out. We don't think that they were actually doing fishing. But you can get a lot from, you know, just stuff that's washed up. And also there's been a massive change in terms of evidence for plant food. There were hints always from the Near East. There are sites in the Near East because Neanderthals lived not only in Europe, they're actually more of a Eurasian species. Geographically, there's more land in Asia that they were in. So in the Near East sites, we had sort of preserved seeds, sort of fruits and things like this in some of the fires in the hearths. But people were like, you know, maybe that's just stuff that fell in, you know, by the wind. But actually, as we started to be able to look at their own bodies, we can see from isotopic evidence now, it's starting to hint that there was some plant elements in terms of the protein they were eating. But also, amazingly, we can actually look at the tartar in between their teeth, because, you know, they didn't seem to clean the teeth as well, but that's not so good for their gum disease, but it's great for archaeologists. And we can look and find like tiny microfossils and starches and things. And those studies, there's not been that many because it's quite a new technique, have shown that there were wild grass seeds being eaten, and amazingly, one of my favorite ones, water lily root. And that's not something that you accidentally sort of come across. That's, you know, that's a knowledge of the environment, and it's a knowledge of, you know, of going into pools, of which water lilies are okay to take. And we also have evidence that some of these starches appear to have been damaged in a way that would match wet cooking, as in boiling, rather than like parching or charring. So although the evidence is quite small and piecemeal, it's opened up a really different picture on the variety of what they were doing. And certainly, you know, Neanderthals living in Wales during a cold period would have looked, you know, with surprise at what Neanderthals in Palestine in a warm period were eating, you know. So we should remember that we say the Neanderthals, but there's huge diversity there.
Yeah, feeling quite hungry now.
Well, they were especially keen on offal, offal and fat, we believe, and bone marrow.
Fine, offal.
Could I just ask, Rebecca, the idea of them sort of boiling things and processing water lily roots, unless you get very lucky and you happen to have studied the only one that did that, presumably that indicates some sort of cultural sharing of information. That's, I mean, it's a sophistication that really feels very human, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is the thing about Neanderthals, that we have a lot of evidence that doesn't say that much, and then sometimes we get finds that are just like, wow, they have such huge implications about technology, about the social groups, you know, who's going out and collecting this stuff. You know, debates about, did women hunt? I'm sure they did sometimes, but if we look at hunter-gatherers, the cases where women hunt, it seems to be connected to other things, like, for example, how far away you have to go to hunt the animals, because if it's too far, it becomes difficult to take your babies with you and your young children. If there's someone back at camp that will look after them, that's okay, and if it's only a few hours. But if you have to travel a day to go and get some reindeer, it's going to be less likely. So again, you know, what Neanderthals were doing is definitely going to be variable. There probably is cultural variation and traditions, I would say. I mean, we can see that even there's a really, really cool study that's just come out about bonobo hunting. So bonobos are the smaller relatives of chimpanzees. They are both our closest living relatives. They both hunt animals. And two bonobo groups which live very close to each other, basically there's no reason other than each group's tradition as to why one focuses on sort of squirrels, more like tree squirrels, and one is more focused on little tiny antelopes that live in the wood. And it really does seem to be down to just, that's what we do. There's no difference in the environment. It's not about who is hunting or what. So that idea of traditions, I think we should expect that.
That's remarkable as well from an ecological perspective. You've got what we would call niche separation or niche partitioning going on, but driven by a social culture rather than adaptation. I mean, that's really
really it's cool. Very interesting. I mean, what we don't have a good handle on is how well connected different Neanderthal groups across large regions were. There is some evidence from the stone tools that there may have been some kind of cultural barrier basically going down the middle of Europe, where in the center of Europe and the East, they made their stone tools in a bit of a different way to the ones in the West. But how that could have translated into other aspects of their culture is, you know, I'd love to know. It's fascinating. We can't see it. There's no clear pattern in the different animals they hunted, but I would expect that there may have been some kind of different focus for sure.
That's fascinating. Okay, next topic I wanted to discuss is violence. Starting with you, Rebecca, violence in Neanderthals. So they've often been portrayed as having short, brutal lives. What does the fossil evidence reveal about how some of them died, and how, and what does that indicate in terms of how violent their societies were?
Well, we certainly do have evidence that a fair number of Neanderthals had poor health, or they suffered an illness, or some kind of injuries. That's not sort of debated at all, and there's good evidence for that. Not every Neanderthal that we find has something wrong with them. I'll say that, but yeah, I mean, there's definitely overall. It looks like they did have tough lives, and we can see that even not from injuries, but from, for example, the evidence for the robustness, the heaviness of their bones, and the muscle markings. We can see that they were immensely active. They were hugely sort of active. Presumably that's walking around a lot, but also it's going to be hunting. Hunting is, even if you throw spears, and it does appear that they did have thrown and thrusting spears, you're still at risk of some close quarters sort of, dangerous encounters. Having said all that, though, if you compare it to hunter-gatherers, it doesn't look like there's like a dramatic overabundance in Neanderthals. I mean, it does depend on the kind of hunter-gathering people you look at. But one of the things that with Neanderthals was, they're quite battered sometimes, but that doesn't all have to be anything to do with sort of violence between each other. It could be much more like what we do see in other hunter-gatherers, which is that quite often a high proportion of the men in hunter-gatherer societies can either be ill or injured, because it's just hard to make a living as a hunter-gatherer. And that does change depending on where you live. If you look, for example, at some of the societies from the indigenous peoples in North America, up in the north in the woodlands, in the winter you have deep snow. You've still got to hunt in that, and wading through deep snow is massively energy intensive, and you've got more sort of chance of slipping. But it really depends on the kind of environment you're in. But I think overall there is certainly no overwhelming picture that they were beating each other up. I really don't think that is well supported. There are a couple of cases where we have head injuries, which if we apply like modern forensic standards, then it does look as if they probably have been struck by something. Could be an animal hoof, but there is one case where a Neanderthal seems to have had a projectile object entering the body, and it's got lodged in its rib, and the rib actually grew back around it. And this is from a site in Iraq called Shanadar, and that the hole, where the rib grew back around it would match the stone tip of a spear. So maybe that's the case. But if you then compare it to early Homo sapiens people, so basically the contemporaries of the Neanderthals, we also have evidence for them having quite battered bodies, not being very healthy a lot of the time because it's just difficult. And also there are definite cases there where you could argue for some kind of interpersonal violence. And there's one quite famous burial from Russia called Sungir, which is about 28,000 years old. And that individual, this is an adult male, looks as if he's had his throat slit. We don't have anything quite as clear cut as that for Neanderthals. So it's difficult to say, but I reject the idea that we should expect them to be violent as well, because that's a different question. And if you come back to looking at chimpanzees and bonobos, those two species only separated about the same time ago as we separated from Neanderthals, sort of 700,000 years-ish. They have completely different social structures, and chimpanzees are well known for being very violent within their groups. They're male dominated, and females don't really have strong friendships. They have quite lonely lives. They are battered. You know, they have a really hard time. And with other groups as well, chimpanzees are not keen on strangers at all. They have patrols around their territory. They will kill strangers. Bonobos, totally different. It's female dominated. It's all the whole of their society is held together by sort of social affection and the physical expression of that, whether it's grooming or actually sex. They sort of just have sex whenever they're excited or happy, or if they're sad, and you know, so they just do things completely differently. Yet we have for such a long time focused on chimps for Neanderthals, as if bonobos are like, well, that's not likely, but there's no reason why we should do that. And if we look at what Neanderthal society from the rest of archaeology looks like, it's a society that seems to be based around cooperation in hunting, in gathering, and bringing food back to share. That's much more matching what we see with bonobos, who don't have high food pressures, which we see in chimpanzees. And that's what we think underlies the differences between chimp and bonobo societies. It's about food pressures as well. So I don't think we should assume that they were violent within themselves or violent to others either.
Okay. And Adam, are we, modern humans, a violent species? And what does our evolutionary history tell us about the human propensity to violence? And also, can a better understanding of our evolutionary past help us move forwards to a more peaceful future, do you think?
Well, it's a tricky question to answer, because you can find, so, I mean, first of all, if we look across mammals, the idea of killing a member of your own species, you'll often hear people say humans are the only species that kills members of its own species, and that's a lovely idea, but it's not supported by the evidence at all. No. If you look at, I mean, there are honeybees kill each other. You know, honeybee queen's sting is adapted for killing other queens. You know, committing sort of siblicide. So even in insects we see this. But if we look across mammals, there was a really nice phylogenetic study that was done that compared all of the data that could be found, and they found intraspecific lethal conspecific violence, basically killing a member of your own species, was supported in I think 44% of species. And the suggestion was the only reason it wasn't supported in many of the others was because we hadn't studied them. So you find this across the sort of animal kingdom. Primates are unusually well represented in this, you know, as Rebecca's just sort of talked about. And humans seem to excel. We seem to be about 7 times more violent in terms of lethal conspecific violence than you would expect from our sort of phylogenetic kind of history. So there's certainly the case that we do appear to be more violent, and violence seems to be a product of it. The modern world is obviously, you know, human violence is a major problem. There's no doubt about that, but equally it's easy to get carried away by this, particularly when we look at the media depiction of violence. Actually, most of us are not violent most of the time. Sure, we have the capacity to be violent. We're quite a useful kind of organism, right? We've got lots of sort of points and stuff. We're very well coordinated. We're actually quite strong. We've got good levers. We're clever, right? We can use our environment. You know, we can Jason Bourne the whole thing, right? We are good. We are good at killing each other. There's no doubt about it. But we don't do it most of the time, and I think that's a really
kind of want to say, speak for yourself, Adam. Yeah.
Sorry, I lost you there, Catherine.
So
sorry.
For yourself, Adam. I can't imagine I'd be very good. I'd be very good as Jason Bourne.
yeah.
Oh,
well, movie people are good at violence, right? But actually, everyday violence tends to be much more deeply unpleasant and sometimes more horribly effective, perhaps. But the reality is most of the time we're not. So yes, we do have this ability to sort of wreak havoc, but we also have mental structures that have evolved presumably to prevent us from doing that. And we have the idea that we can control our behaviors. So yes, we do have that, and there's undoubtedly some advantages to being aggressive. I mean, particularly within groups. You know, you can see aggression within groups for dominance and for personal advantage, but of course that trades off at some point by becoming alienated from the group. But of course, within group violence is one thing, but between groups could also be that there could be advantages to being violent to other groups, and there's no doubt that can be an issue, and we see that of course across the world now. So I think there is an evolutionary sort of backdrop to it, but I think more important is the controls that we have on ourselves. We don't have to behave like that most of the time, and most of the time most people don't. There was a series of interesting physiological studies or sort of anatomical studies that looked at this that didn't gain a lot of support, but it's quite interesting that people have gone in this direction. One became known as the punch-proof face hypothesis, which was the idea that the human male face, which is sort of more, but the skull is more buttressed and a bit more solid than the female. And the idea was that it had evolved this way to absorb blows from other males. And then there was the sort of the buttressed fist kind of hypothesis, which was the idea that our ability to make a fist and our hand sort of anatomy and so on was basically to do with punching people. The guy that put that forward actually tested it with he got arms from medical cadavers and sort of tied all the tendons onto various strings and sort of swung them against dumbbells and stuff, and came up with this idea that the buttressed fist worked. It was fairly heavily ridiculed actually when it came out, but now he's done some more work and seems that he's finding a bit more support. But I think that's perhaps taking things too far, because also actually when you see people wreaking violence on each other, they're not sort of standing back and using beautiful. Like that's all movie stuff. Actually, when you see people really going for each other, that's not what we do. So I think, are we violent? There is a tendency towards violence in our clade. There's no doubt. Possibly down to the fact that we are able to do it. Are we violent most of the time? No. And just as you can find and you can come up with very plausible evolutionary scenarios that would encourage the selection of violent tendencies, you can also, of course, come up with very convincing evolutionary scenarios that would encourage the mitigation of those violent tendencies, because ultimately speaking, an incredibly violent society is not going to do as well as a society that is able to control that and get along. And within humans, we do see some aspect of group selection in a sense. It's kind of, let's not get involved in the sticky area of it, but obviously if you've got one society fighting another society, which happens, wars do happen, then you do have this sort of group effect going on. So it's a very tangled mess, and I think it's really interesting that you can find very, very convincing arguments that we are more violent than we were in the past. You can find very, very convincing arguments that we are, and evidence-supported arguments that we are less violent than we were in the past, and really convincing evidence-supported arguments that we're exactly as violent as we were in the past. And I think, our tendency for violence is a problem in society, and something we haven't really got a grip on. It's something we haven't really understood. There's that article that I'm sure Rebecca can talk about much better than me, about talking about those Neanderthal wars, the sort of war with humans. This kind of I think we are still lured slightly by the romanticism of violence. Where you look at the output, when I was writing that chapter, I started actually thinking about what was on the television a lot more, and you see this glorification, particularly of male violence. You see male characters, the most famous film characters, think about them, right? James Bond, basically a violent, misogynistic psychopath, right? Or sociopath, really. Jason Bourne, a trained killer. We see these, most of the male characters that we see in films actually glamorize violence, and I think we have a very, this is beyond our evolutionary past, although we can always see echoes in it. I think we have a very generally unhealthy relationship with violence, where we accept that it's a problem, and yet at the same time we glamorize it and to a large extent reward it. So it's a very tricky thing, and you can see echoes of that in academic writing, as we saw this week with sort of some rather almost fetishistic kind of depictions of sort of Homo sapien and Neanderthal violence, which Rebecca can.
Yeah, I don't know if audience members came across that. There was an article published by a dinosaur and lizard expert purporting to say that there was literally war between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, and that got picked up by the BBC, Yahoo. I don't even know where it's gone on the internet now. It's probably everywhere. But myself and other people who understand the archaeology of Neanderthals would say there is zero evidence for a conflict or a war, because those words are very specific. They imply organization and different kinds of societies. Yeah, sure, there is evidence that Neanderthals experienced some violence in their lives. So did early Homo sapiens, but we don't know what the source of most of that was. And that article was totally unsupported. It comes back to this issue that we began this discussion about fake news and expertise, and why people who read that article were willing to reject what I and other people were saying in favor of hearing this other claim from somebody who admitted they hadn't even read the archaeological literature, because it fits their notion that we are too fluffy in how we want to view our past, and oh no, this is the reality, that it really was all about war and conflict. And you know who else like to talk about conflict between species and stuff? Eugenicists. That's big. Let the more superior species come out, and framing human evolution as about conflict. Yeah, I don't think we want to go there if there isn't the evidence for it, and there isn't.
And talking about the evidence.
Sorry, I was going to say as well, if you think about the biggest step that we've had is the evolution of, well, the development, I keep saying the evolution, the development of agriculture, that couldn't have possibly have happened without huge amounts of cooperation. So even in our past, when we look back, it's going to get all kind of nature red in tooth and claw, but actually the reality is the biggest development in our past, it would have involved a huge amount of cooperation and knowledge sharing and working together. So just because something exists and may have been a feature, it doesn't have to become this dominant feature. But I think it does, because of this unhealthy relationship we seem to have with violence, a fascination with it that's in certain, largely male, let's be honest, a largely male fascination with it that dominates. And yeah, the image from that article of sort of Napoleon on a horse, majestic in war, I think that just absolutely underpinned where that article was coming from. It was the glorification of conflict, and then trying to drag another species into it. It's also unfair.
So I wanted to ask Rebecca about the relationship between Neanderthals and modern humans. We know now that a lot of Homo sapiens carry Neanderthal DNA. So that speaks to the interaction that there obviously was between the two types of humans. Can you tell us what's known about this, and what's your take and your understanding, or what even is your imagination about how these two different species, us and the Neanderthals, kind of interacted? And while Rebecca's speaking, if anyone from the audience would like to ask questions, please go ahead and fill in the question box. Thank you. So back to you, Rebecca.
Yeah, I think, when it was only a decade ago that we had confirmation from nuclear genetic material that there had been interbreeding with Neanderthals. Up to that point, it was still debated, and the mitochondrial DNA evidence we had, which is only transferred through the maternal line, that didn't show it. But when we got the nuclear DNA, it changed people's perception of Neanderthals big time. I think people really started to relate to them in a different way. But also, it does raise questions about the past. And since then, we've gone from sort of one piece of evidence to multiple phases of some kind of interbreeding going on, probably going back well beyond 200,000 years ago. So that's pretty early in the span of when Neanderthals appear, and so do we. We actually sort of both seem to emerge in fossil terms roughly about the same time, sort of 350,000 years ago, something like that, 400. And so if we were already in contact and interbreeding before 200, that's quite early. Having said that, though, in all those cases, and it may be as many as 6 different periods that we can identify when this was going on, it probably was never like at a gigantic scale. I don't think we're looking at like wholesale assimilation of entire regions or anything like that. The question of the mechanics, we know that Neanderthals and humans could produce hybrid offspring, because that's why we see the genetics in us today. So they had to produce a hybrid offspring that were themselves fertile. So sure, it's physically possible, but there's two questions really. One is why were they having sex and making babies, and what does that say about their societies overall? We don't know is the answer to why they were meeting up, how those meetings happened, what stimulated that. We do know now that early Homo sapiens people were certainly dispersing out of the African continent a lot earlier than used to be believed. We didn't suddenly appear 40,000 years ago just as the Neanderthals disappear. There's a much more ancient presence right across into East Asia. Certainly by probably 80,000 to 120,000 years ago in East Asia, and in Australia by 65,000 years ago, 60,000 years. So there's certainly, wherever the interbreeding was going on, it wasn't just limited to sort of the margins around Africa. It could have been happening in many areas. And we also do not know the eastern extent of where Neanderthals lived either. That we know they were into Siberia and Uzbekistan, but we don't know if they got further in to East Asia. However, as I said, we don't know what sort of stimulated those meetings. Presumably there may have been just curiosity. But yeah, sure, there could have been some conflict. That could have been one aspect, but I don't think it has to be the assumption, as I said earlier, that all of these situations where Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens and Neanderthals and other hominins at the same time, so the Denisovans as well, who appears were more sort of Asian distributed, and we know they were interbreeding with them, and we were interbreeding with the Denisovans too. There's no reason why we should assume that there was always going to be like a flashpoint when they were contacted, or that any kind of sex was coercive. It doesn't have to be. I think we should probably expect that some of it was and some of it wasn't.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the interesting points is that if you have hybrid children, we know that some of those hybrids were being raised in Neanderthal groups early on because there's a replacement of their Y chromosome, so that's the male line. So that implies that they were being raised in Neanderthal groups, and later some of the hybrid infants must have been raised in Homo sapiens groups. And so the question then is, if you have infants that have come from situations of conflict, of rape, how likely is it that those babies would be actually cared for and would flourish enough and be able to fit into those societies that they then make their own sort of relationships and have their own children and things like that? So I think there's a question that we need to not only look at sort of, are Neanderthals violent fundamentally? I don't think so. Are we violent fundamentally? Well, it really depends on the context and the society. If you look at hunter-gatherers, there's a lot of variation. Some of them are quite prone to raiding and conflict, others aren't. But we should also consider what does it mean to raise children who have come from two different cultures, and does that imply that there was some kind of fundamental similarity, or are we looking at children who were not wanted? It's difficult to say, but I think we should assume at least some of this was consensual and was about curiosity and a desire to know others.
It's an amazing thought. And we all have those Neanderthal ancestors ourselves, which just blows my mind. So thank you. I was waiting to see if anyone else had any questions, because we're coming to the end of our hour. In fact, we are at the end. So I think we'll wrap up here. Thank you to Adam and Rebecca for absolutely fascinating talk. So much information in there. Really, really appreciate that. Such brilliant, interesting subject. I wanted to remind everyone that this talk is available until the end of November, and that Chinese subtitles will be added after 48 hours. So if there's anyone else you know who might like to see it, then please send them the link. In the meantime, thank you to everyone for coming.
Thank you. Yes.
Enjoy the rest of the festival. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you.